Hi, I'm Corey. I'm a student with the Introduction to Music Production course with the Berklee College of Music. It's taught online. Each week we are asked to choose a particular subject and teach it. So this week we'll be talking about cables. Now we'll be talking about digital and analog cables, but we'll be focused primarily on analog. There's a vast array of digital cables in the recording world, but A, we don't have time to talk about them, B, you won't be using the majority of them, and C, the easiest way to get the biggest difference in sound quality in your recordings is through analog cables. So, with analog cables, there are only two basic types that you want to concern yourself with, and that is unbalanced and balanced cables. I'm going to start with unbalanced because that's the kind of cable you're most likely used to using. Unbalanced cables, such as this one right here, are mono cables, and they're also referred to as TS cables, patch cords, instrument cables, quarter-inch cables. It's called the TS cable because it's referring to the tip, which picks up the signal, and the sleeve, which shields the signal. So that tip picks up a mono signal. And as such, they're cheap cables, and they're great for use with things like this here electric guitar, and the signal is picked up, you can see right there. Now the problem with unbalanced cables is that if they're pretty much any longer than 6 feet, you're going to notice a degradation in signal quality because it'll pick up a lot of hum and noise. Even less than 6 feet, if you have more powerful sources such as cell phones nearby, or AC adapters, or a surge protector full of AC adapters, that's going to interfere with the signal. So you want to keep that in mind when you're laying out the cables in your recording studio, and you want to keep them as far away from those sources as possible. The second kind of cable is balanced. And once you start investing in a little higher quality gear and your studio takes a leap, you'll find yourself you'd be using balanced cables a lot more often because balanced cables, this is an XLR cable and this is a TRS cable, which looks a lot like a TS cable, only it has the R in there, which means it's got a tip which picks up one signal, a ring which picks up a second signal, and a sleeve which again shields the signal. So it can pick up two signals, which means it can be used as a stereo cord, which means that a lot of people like to use them for their headphones. I also use them for my studio monitors. What the two signals are typically used for is it sends one signal and then it's of sound, and then it sends the exact opposite, in a way, of the sound on the second, on the ring. And that's used to cancel out any noise. So you can have a 50-foot balanced cable and it won't pick up any noise. The important thing to remember about balanced cables is that if at any point before the analog to digital conversion, before your sound hits digital, if at any point either an input, an output, or a cable are unbalanced in that signal, the entire signal becomes unbalanced and it's susceptible to noise again. So you want to keep that in mind when you buy an interface. I bought an interface and found out later on that the inputs are all unbalanced. So even though I have balanced cables going from my inputs to from my outputs to my inputs, the signal is unbalanced. I picked out balanced cables because I know eventually I'll upgrade to a better interface that has balanced outs, but until that happens, I won't be getting the benefit. However, the cables are less than 6 feet, so it's not an issue. You typically can go out and get one of these, which is called a direct box. This is a passive direct box. It cost me about $35–40, and what it does is it takes this instrument in and you plug it in, and it then levels the signal. So if you're familiar with impedance, it matches the impedance of where it's going, so you don't have to worry about the signal being too hot or too quiet. In addition to that, it balances the signal. So it goes out to this XLR cable here, and At that point, you can have the cable run 50 feet, 100 feet, and the signal doesn't pick up any noise as soon as it hits this box. You still want to keep in mind any outside sources before it hits the box, so you don't want to be running this by any surge protectors or have your cell phone parked right next to it. That won't be great. This is great because this is about as basic a neat DI box as you can get, and it still has more than I'll ever need. It has these signal attenuators here. The camera's not focusing, but it's a minus 20 dB signal attenuator. I don't know what this filter does. It has a input through, which is actually an output that can go to your amplifier, and so you can directly monitor your signal. And in the back here you have some filters to cut out ground interference, and a phase inverter, which again I wouldn't even know when I would use this, and this is about as beginner of a box you can get. Hi, this is part 2 where we'll be talking about digital cables. The first digital cable I'm going to talk about is USB. It doesn't really need much of an introduction, but most gear that you'll get nowadays connects through USB. Even MIDI gear, like a MIDI controller, will connect through that, or a keyboard will connect through USB. Sound interfaces and everything else generally connect through something like USB or Firewire or Thunderbolt. Firewire is another kind of cable. I don't have one with me. I also don't have Thunderbolt because I'm not a Mac user, but they are the standard cable now for most Mac computers. Firewire is also really popular, but it's much rarer. So if you want to get gear that comes with Firewire, they are usually very high quality. It's usually a great idea, but you want to make sure that your computer actually has a Firewire input, because a lot of them don't come standard with it. So they're really cheap to get and install, but it's something you want to keep in mind. It's something you don't want to come home with your brand new piece of gear and find out you can't even plug it in yet. That's always very disappointing. So for most of the older digital gear, you'll probably come across this, which is a MIDI cable. The reason I'm holding two is because most MIDI gear required a MIDI in and a MIDI out. These cables are labeled, so this one here is the MIDI in, which would make this one here the MIDI out, and you can't mix them up. The MIDI out is the output, so it sends a signal out from the keyboard and into a drum machine, or in this case a computer, to control whatever synthesizer, play whatever notes it wants to. And the in is used to send a signal back into the keyboard. So if you have a drum machine, it sends a signal back to the keyboard and can actually start playing your keyboard for you. Same thing with your computer. You might draw a couple of notes in Live or Cubase or whatever, and it can play your computer for you if you have a MIDI in. Most devices, like I said, USB handles the MIDI in and out, and it can handle several MIDI signals without much problem. Other cables you run into, digital cables, are SPDIF, which are a really popular choice for plugging in home stereo gear, like a Walkman or your stereo or whatnot, into your soundboard or your interface, so you can record that signal that way. So that's it for cables that you'll probably use in your home studio, and I hope it helped.